What's the most disturbing thing you found in a family member's belongings after they died? I found the first envelope in Uncle Graham's desk drawer 3 hours after his funeral. The drawer was locked, which seemed odd for a home office, but I'd found his keyring in the kitchen. Inside were 12 manila envelopes, each labeled with a woman's name and a date spanning the last 15 years. I opened the one on top. Claire Mendoza, 2019. Inside were photographs of a woman leaving work, getting into her car, entering her apartment building, timestamps on each photo, receipts from a private investigator, notes in Graham's handwriting detailing her schedule, her routines, her habits. My hand started shaking as I opened the second envelope. Different woman, same pattern. Surveillance photos, investigation reports, detailed notes about her daily life. I spread them across his desk and counted. 12 women. 12 years of systematic stalking documented and filed away like legal cases. My uncle, the respected corporate attorney, had been tracking women with the same precision he used for contract negotiations. The notes were what made my stomach turn. Graham wrote about each woman like she was a specimen under observation. Claire works late Thursdays, usually alone in the parking garage by 8 p.m., walks the same route through the park every Saturday morning, doesn't lock her bedroom window. The level of detail was horrifying. He knew their gym schedules, their grocery shopping days, their friends' names, where they kept spare keys. Some notes went back months before the surveillance photos started, suggesting he'd been watching them in person first. One envelope for a woman named Yuki had a strand of dark hair taped to a page with a note saying, "From her car seat, November 3rd. I dropped it like it burned me. This wasn't casual obsession. This was predatory planning, the kind of documentation you create when you're building toward something. I pulled out my phone to call the police, then stopped. What exactly was I reporting? Photos and notes weren't illegal, but every instinct I had screamed that this was evidence of something terrible. I opened my laptop and started searching the women's names. The first 3 came up immediately in news articles. Claire Mendoza, reported missing in 2019, last seen leaving work. Jessica Liu, disappeared 2017, car found abandoned near her apartment. Amber Westbrook, missing since 2015, no trace ever found. My vision started tunneling as I searched the others. 8 of the 12 women had disappeared, not died in accidents or moved away, vanished completely. The dates on Graham's envelopes aligned perfectly with when they went missing. The last envelope was dated 3 weeks ago. Sophia Reyes, 2024. Recent photos, detailed surveillance notes, but no news articles yet. I found her Facebook profile. Active, posting regularly, alive. She had no idea someone had been documenting her life in preparation for something. I grabbed the envelopes and ran downstairs where my mother was packing kitchen items into boxes. I dumped everything on the dining table and told her to look. She went pale, then gray, then sat down hard in a chair. My mother's hands trembled as she picked up the envelope with the oldest date, Lindsay Hartman, 2009. She opened it carefully like it might explode and pulled out the surveillance photos. Her face crumpled and she started crying without making any sound, just tears streaming down her face while she stared at the images. I asked what was wrong, and she whispered that she knew Lindsay. They'd worked together at a nonprofit 15 years ago. Lindsay had disappeared one night after a company event, and police never found anything. My mother had gone to the vigils and helped organize search parties. The whole time, her brother had an envelope full of evidence in his locked drawer. She looked at me with this expression of complete horror and said Graham had attended one of the search events. He'd stood there with the family and volunteers, pretending to care while knowing exactly what had happened to Lindsay. The realization that he'd been involved in her friend's disappearance, that he'd comforted her while hiding his guilt, made her physically ill. She ran to the bathroom and I heard her being sick. When she came back, I'd already called the police. I explained about the envelopes, the missing women, the level of detail in Graham's surveillance. The dispatcher said someone would be there within 30 minutes and told us not to touch anything else. My mother sat at the dining table staring at the spread of envelopes and asked how this could be possible. Graham was her brother. She'd known him for 62 years. He'd taught her to ride a bike and helped her with math homework and walked her down the aisle at her wedding. How could that person be the same one who stalked and presumably murdered 12 women? I didn't have an answer. The doorbell rang exactly 28 minutes later. 2 detectives introduced themselves as Kowalski and Tran, and I led them to the dining table. Detective Kowalski's face went completely still as she looked at the envelopes. She pulled on gloves and carefully examined the contents, while Detective Tran took our statements. They asked detailed questions about Graham, about when we'd found the materials, about whether we'd moved or touched anything else in the house. Detective Kowalski made a phone call, and within an hour, the house was full of crime scene investigators. They photographed everything, bagged the envelopes as evidence, and started a systematic search of the entire property. My mother and I sat on the front porch while strangers in protective gear went through Graham's life looking for more evidence of his crimes. A forensics van pulled up, and people started carrying equipment inside. Detective Tran sat with us and explained gently that this was now a homicide investigation, that the house was a crime scene, and we wouldn't be able to go back inside for several days. She asked if we had somewhere to stay, and I said we could go to my apartment across town. My mother just stared at Graham's perfect Victorian house with its manicured lawn and thought about all the times she'd visited for holidays, sitting in that dining room, eating meals prepared by a serial killer. She asked Detective Tran how many women they thought he'd actually killed, and the detective said, honestly, they didn't know yet. We stayed at my apartment that night, and my mother couldn't sleep. I heard her pacing in the guest room, then found her at 3 a.m. sitting at my kitchen table with her phone, reading every news article about the missing women. She'd made a list of their names, ages, last known locations, 8 confirmed disappearances that matched Graham's envelopes, and 4 women who were still alive as far as we could tell. She looked up at me with red eyes and said she'd failed all of them. She'd had Thanksgiving dinner with Graham just months ago, had talked to him on the phone weekly, had loved him despite their distance. She'd never suspected anything was wrong, never noticed any signs. I sat down across from her and said nobody expects their family member to be a predator, but she shook her head and pulled up an article about Claire Mendoza from 2019. Claire's mother had given an interview saying her daughter mentioned feeling followed in the weeks before she disappeared. Multiple women in the articles described similar feelings of being watched. The signs were there. My mother had just never connected them to her brother. Detective Kowalski called the next morning asking us to come to the station. The search of Graham's house had uncovered more evidence in his basement, a locked storage room that his assistant hadn't even known existed. My mother gripped my hand so tight it hurt as we drove downtown. At the station, they led us to a small conference room where Detective Kowalski spread out photographs on the table. Not surveillance photos this time, personal items that belonged to the missing women. Claire's distinctive silver bracelet that her family had mentioned in missing person reports, Jessica's college ring, Amber's custom phone case. Items that proved Graham hadn't just documented these women, he'd taken them. The detective explained they'd found a false wall in the basement storage room, behind it a small space containing boxes of trophies from his victims, jewelry, clothing, ID cards, personal effects, each box labeled with a name and date, physical evidence connecting Graham to 8 missing women. But that wasn't the worst discovery. Detective Tran opened her laptop and turned it toward us. They'd found Graham's computer in the study, and forensics had cracked his encrypted files. Inside were videos, not surveillance footage, but recordings of the actual abductions. Graham had documented everything with the same meticulous attention to detail he used in his legal work. The detective didn't show us the content, just explained that the videos provided definitive proof of 8 murders. They'd also found detailed plans for future victims, including Sofia Reyes. Graham's calendar had an entry for next month labeled SR Acquisition, with a location and time. He'd been planning her abduction before his heart attack killed him. Detective Kowalski said they'd already contacted Sofia and the 3 other living women from the envelopes, warning them and offering protective services. Sofia had started crying on the phone because she'd felt watched for weeks, but thought she was being paranoid. She'd been right. Graham had been tracking her, waiting for the perfect opportunity. My mother asked a question that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. She wanted to know why. What made a successful lawyer with every advantage turn into a serial killer? Detective Tran explained that forensics had also found journals dating back to Graham's 20s, detailed fantasies about control and domination, about making women disappear. He'd been planning this for decades before he acted on it. The first victim, Lindsay, came 14 years into his legal career. Something had triggered him to escalate from fantasy to reality, and they were still trying to understand what. The journals revealed a man who saw other people, especially women, as objects to be acquired and controlled. His legal work gave him the perfect cover because everyone saw him as respectable, trustworthy, meticulous. Nobody suspected the boring attorney of living a double life. My mother started crying again and said our father would be devastated. Detective Kowalski's expression shifted, and she asked carefully when my grandfather had died. My mother said 15 years ago. The detective pulled out a timeline they'd constructed and showed us. Graham's first murder happened 6 months after his father's death. The media found out about Graham's crimes within 48 hours. His face was on every news channel, that professional headshot from his law firm's website, next to photos of his victims. The stories called him the collector because of the trophies in his basement. Reporters showed up at my apartment and my mother's house, wanting interviews and comments. The law firm released a statement expressing shock and cooperating fully with investigators. Graham's colleagues gave interviews saying they'd never noticed anything unusual, that he was professional and reliable and utterly normal. Several mentioned his dedication to detail and his ability to focus on complex cases for hours without distraction. They meant it as praise for his work ethic, but I heard it differently now. That same focus and attention to detail had gone into stalking women and planning their murders. The traits that made him successful in law had made him effective as a killer. His methodical nature, his patience, his ability to think strategically, all of it, repurposed for horror. The families of the victims started calling. Claire's mother wanted to know everything about where we'd found the envelope, what the photos showed, whether Graham had said anything about her daughter. I had to tell her that her daughter's final moments were on video in police evidence, that Graham had documented her murder like a legal deposition. She made this awful sound and hung up. Jessica's father called next, then Amber's sister. Each conversation was torture. They wanted answers I couldn't give them. Why did he choose their loved ones? Did they suffer? Where were the bodies? Detective Kowalski had told us they were searching Graham's property and several other locations mentioned in his journals, but finding burial sites would take time. Some families might never recover their daughters, sisters, mothers. They'd have confirmation their loved ones were dead, but no graves to visit. No closure beyond knowing Graham was responsible. My mother took these calls until she couldn't anymore, then stopped answering the phone completely. The investigation expanded beyond the 12 envelopes. Police started looking at other unsolved disappearances in our region over the past 15 years, checking for any connection to Graham. They found 3 more women whose cases fit his pattern, women who'd disappeared without a trace, whose cases had gone cold, whose families had been waiting years for answers. Forensics found references to them in Graham's journals, though no physical evidence yet. The count went to 11 confirmed murders with evidence, and 3 more highly suspected. 14 women destroyed by one man who'd hidden behind respectability and family connections. The news started calling my mother for comment, asking how she never knew her brother was a killer. The implication was clear. Someone should have noticed. Someone should have stopped him. She started getting hate mail from people who thought she must have suspected something, must have protected him. The guilt was crushing her, even though she'd had no way of knowing. I hired a lawyer to handle the media and protect my mother from the harassment. The victims' families filed wrongful death suits against Graham's estate, seeking whatever assets he'd left behind. The house, his savings, his retirement accounts. Everything would go to settlements for the families, which seemed right, but didn't feel like enough. Money couldn't bring back the murdered women or erase the trauma their families endured. Graham's law firm was sued too, accused of enabling him by providing cover and respectability. The firm settled quietly to avoid trial. I watched these legal proceedings from a distance, numb to all of it. My mother stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped functioning. Her doctor prescribed medication for depression and anxiety. She'd lost her brother twice, first to death and then to the revelation of who he really was. The grief was complicated by horror and guilt. She attended victim support groups but couldn't make herself speak. How do you mourn someone who destroyed so many lives? 3 months after finding the envelopes, Detective Kowalski called with news. They'd found human remains on a property Graham had owned outside the city, a rural lot he'd purchased 20 years ago under a shell company. The forensics team had recovered skeletal remains of multiple women buried in shallow graves. Dental records would take time to process, but preliminary evidence suggested these were some of the missing victims. My mother's friend Lindsay might finally come home to her family. The property search was ongoing. They'd brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, systematically covering every inch of land. The news coverage intensified with aerial footage of the excavation site, reporters speculating about how many bodies they'd find. Each discovered grave meant another family getting the worst confirmation, another woman's story ending with a forensics tent and evidence markers. My mother watched the news coverage compulsively, crying for women she'd never met, but felt connected to through her brother's crimes. The trial never happened because Graham was dead, but the prosecutor held a press conference presenting the evidence anyway. The public needed to know the scope of his crimes. Detective Tran walked through the timeline of murders, the surveillance methods, the trophy collection. She showed photos of the basement storage room and explained the encrypted video files. She talked about Sophia Reyes and how close she'd come to becoming victim number 15. The prosecutor announced that based on all evidence, they were officially closing 14 homicide cases, attributing them to Graham Northrup. 14 families would finally have answers, though not the kind anyone wanted. The press conference ended with a statement from Claire Mendoza's mother, representing all the victims' families. She spoke about her daughter's life, her dreams, her kindness. She said Graham had taken her daughter's future but wouldn't take her memory. The families would make sure these women were remembered as people, not just victims of a serial killer. My mother and I attended a memorial service organized by the victims' families 6 months after Graham's death. 14 photos were displayed, 14 candles lit, 14 names read aloud. Looking at their faces, seeing how young most of them were, made everything more real than the police reports and news coverage had. These were actual people with families and jobs and hopes. Lindsay had been planning to adopt a child. Claire was engaged. Jessica had just started graduate school. Lives cut short by someone who saw them as objects to collect. My mother approached Lindsay's mother and tried to apologize. Tried to explain she never knew, never suspected. Lindsay's mother stopped her and said it wasn't her fault. The only person responsible was Graham. They hugged and cried together, and I watched my mother start the long process of forgiving herself for something that was never her responsibility. The guilt would never fully leave her, but maybe she could learn to live with it. We sold Graham's house and donated the proceeds to a foundation supporting victims' families. Everything inside was evidence or contaminated by association with his crimes. The furniture, the books, the perfectly maintained garden, all of it tainted. The new owners planned to tear it down completely and rebuild, erasing the physical space where Graham had lived his double life. My mother said she was glad. She never wanted to see that house again, never wanted to remember the holidays spent there, the family dinners, the illusion of normalcy. A year after finding the envelopes, she finally started talking about Graham in therapy, not defending him or making excuses, but processing her own trauma. She'd loved someone who turned out to be a monster. That cognitive dissonance had broken something in her that was slowly healing. She started volunteering with a victim advocacy group, helping other families navigate the aftermath of violent crime. Turning her pain into purpose seemed to help. I think about Sophia Reyes sometimes, the woman who didn't know how close she came to disappearing. Police showed her Graham's surveillance photos and notes about her routines. She'd moved to a different state and changed her name, trying to outrun the knowledge that someone had been planning to kill her. The trauma of almost being a victim was its own kind of hell. She'd never feel completely safe again, would always wonder if someone was watching, would check her locks compulsively, and vary her routines randomly. Graham had stolen her sense of security even though he never touched her. The other 3 living women from the envelopes struggled similarly. Just knowing they'd been chosen, documented, planned for, was enough to shatter their lives. They formed a support group, bonded by the unique trauma of being selected but not taken. Graham's legacy extended beyond his victims to encompass everyone his crimes touched. 2 years after his death, I finally went through the last of Graham's belongings stored in a facility. Boxes of clothes, books, ordinary items that the police had cleared as non-evidentiary. Nothing sinister, just the mundane artifacts of a life that looked normal from the outside. I found a photo album from his childhood with pictures of him and my mother as kids. Graham grinning with missing front teeth, Graham graduating high school, Graham on family vacations. I showed my mother and she traced his face in the photos, trying to understand when the switch flipped, when he became someone capable of horror. Maybe he'd always been that person and just got better at hiding it, or maybe something broke in him gradually, years of dark fantasies eroding whatever conscience he'd started with. We'd never know for sure. The only certainty was that 14 women were dead, and he was responsible. The foundation named after the victims held its first scholarship ceremony on the anniversary of Graham's death. 14 scholarships for young women pursuing careers in law enforcement, forensics, victim advocacy, turning tragedy into opportunity for future generations. My mother spoke at the ceremony about her brother's crimes and the importance of believing women who say they feel unsafe. Several of the victims had reported feeling watched or followed before disappearing, but their concerns were dismissed as paranoia. If someone had listened, investigated, believed them, maybe some of them would still be alive. She asked everyone in attendance to take women's fears seriously, to understand that intuition about danger is often correct. The audience gave her a standing ovation and several victims' family members hugged her afterward, thanking her for using her platform to advocate for change. She'd found a way to channel her guilt and grief into something constructive. I still have nightmares about opening that desk drawer and finding the envelopes. Sometimes I dream I'm one of the women in the photos being stalked and documented, knowing something terrible is coming but unable to stop it. My therapist says this is normal, that discovering something that traumatic would affect anyone. I go to sessions weekly and we talk about survivor's guilt, about the randomness of violence, about how Graham's crimes weren't my fault or my mother's fault. Intellectually, I understand this. Emotionally, it's harder. We'd both loved him, trusted him, believed his respectable facade. That betrayal cut deep, made us question our judgment about everything. If we could be so completely wrong about Graham, what else might we be wrong about? Who else might be hiding darkness behind a normal exterior? The paranoia fades slowly, but the fundamental shift in worldview remains. Evil can wear a suit and smile at family dinners and seem completely ordinary until you find the locked drawer. 3 years after Graham's death, the final victim was identified. Dental records confirmed that remains found on his property belonged to a woman named Tessa Vaughn, who'd disappeared 16 years ago, predating even Lindsay. Graham had killed at least 15 women over 16 years, possibly more that were never documented. The investigation remained open, police still checking cold cases against his known methods. Tessa's family held a funeral at last, able to properly bury their daughter after years of not knowing. My mother attended with me, standing in the back and crying quietly through the service. Afterward, Tessa's father approached us and thanked my mother for finding the evidence that solved his daughter's case. He said closure was painful, but necessary. Not knowing had been its own torture. Now he could grieve properly and remember his daughter's life rather than just her disappearance. We drove home in silence, both of us thinking about the 15 families who'd been shattered by Graham's actions and the ripples of trauma that extended far beyond just the victims. The house was demolished and a small memorial park built on the site, funded by the foundation. 15 trees planted, one for each confirmed victim, with plaques bearing their names and dates. Not birth and death, just their names. Remembering them as people, not statistics. My mother and I attended the dedication ceremony, watching families gather around their daughters' trees, touching the bark and crying. This physical space of remembrance felt important, a way to reclaim the location where Graham had lived and planned his crimes. The park would be a place of healing instead of horror. Children would play here, people would walk their dogs, life would continue in defiance of what Graham had done. Lindsay's mother told the crowd that her daughter loved nature and would have liked having a tree in her memory. Others shared similar sentiments, creating a tapestry of lost lives and interrupted dreams. 15 futures stolen, 15 absences that would echo through families for generations. I keep a photo of Graham on my desk now, from before I knew what he was. He's smiling at the camera during a family Christmas, looking perfectly normal and kind. I keep it as a reminder that evil doesn't announce itself, doesn't look like monsters in movies. It looks like your uncle who sends birthday cards and shows up for holidays. It hides behind respectability and charm and the assumption that normal-looking people don't do terrible things. The photo reminds me to trust my instincts, to listen when something feels wrong even if I can't articulate why, to take seriously the subtle red flags that often get dismissed. Most importantly, it reminds me that finding the truth matters, even when the truth is devastating. Those 15 women and their families deserve justice, deserve to have their stories known, deserved for Graham's crimes to be exposed rather than buried with him. Opening that desk drawer destroyed my family's peace, but gave 15 other families long-awaited answers. That has to count for something. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.